Okay, folks, we are starting on our fiction segment and we are going to care about some of those basic things that you keep track of or pay attention to as you read fiction for good understanding. We talked, you have notes that is, about characterization and things like that and tone and such. We're going to talk, I'm going to lecture, yes, lecture, about separating voice, the narrative voice, from the person of the author. Remember, there is a difference between the authorial voice and the author, a difference between the narrative voice and the author. It applies to all writing, but especially to fiction. So, let's think about this first. Every good piece of writing of any sort is written in a sustained voice, and that voice is never the author, or at least not the author in entirety. Because people, inside your head, you don't have a voice. You have voices, and you choose among these words what you present. You choose moods and modes of presentation. In writing, you very definitely choose. So, a good writer maintains a voice within a given piece. A good writer creates a sustained persona for the piece. And writers, many good ones, to some degree or another, create a sustained persona that covers many pieces of writing or even a full body of work. Mark Twain gives us a wonderful example of that with The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, because The Adventures of Huck Finn is written in dialect, the voice of that adolescent river rat Huck Finn, rather obviously not Mark Twain. Putative author, person behind this, is Mark Twain. Now, Mark Twain's a fictionalized persona. He was created as a writing voice and a speaking voice by Samuel Clemens, a Mississippi River steamboat pilot whose life was rerouted by the Civil War. To give us the generalities on that, Clemens, after a bit of knocking about and working as a printer, met Horace Bixby on a riverboat and persuaded Bixby to teach him the river. Clemens decided to become a pilot. Good paying job. Oh, high skill, important, all this stuff. He would have been a river pilot, and we would not have heard of anything from Mark Twain other than a handful of deliberate satires casually written in his spare time while he plied living on the river. Then the Civil War came, commercial river traffic ended, Sam Clemens fled the Civil War, deciding he had no intention of killing his friends and neighbors on either side, took off to Nevada, and eventually from there became a newspaperman and a writer and such. It was after some of this development, that he became Mark Twain, this figure with the white linen suits and this very deliberate speaking manner and such as that. Hey, he read his travel books and such on stage, made more money doing that than selling them at first. So we have the Mark Twain persona there, and we have the Mark Twain persona sustained more or less through his writing. Much of it, most of what we remember, we think about Twain with his broad sense of humor, his bent for satire and occasional sarcasm, a pretended unsophisticated style that masked some of his knowledge and depth of understandings. But that's all Twain. Underneath that, or behind that, there's a more complete Samuel Clemens, partly Twain, partly a pretty decent family man as things went, partly a man addicted to get rich schemes, made great amounts of money writing and publishing, and threw it away trying to sell inventions that didn't work, and such as that. Now, in Huck Finn, that Twain persona is fully visible in the opening remarks, his deadpan claim regarding dialects. Oh, yes, I used all these precise dialects and so forth. Well, now, bullshit. Quite officially, bullshit on that. As Walter Blair explains, dialect in Twain followed the successful popular pattern. You write the opening words of the character in heavy dialect, so you've established the character. Then you back away from that, because if you're doing popular writing, you want your readers to be able to read it easily and casually. So you just keep things a little bit ungrammatical to keep the reader's attention to the fact that this is, yes, the voice of Huck Finn River Rat, and such as that. And by the way, you make mistakes, whatever your voice, even if you're Mark Twain, because Sam Clemens shows up by accident a time or two. Sam Clemens really shows up when Huck Finn says, "Oh, yes, we passed St. Louis with its lights at 2 a.m." Heavens, Samuel Clemens, riverboat pilot, had a chronometer in his head that stayed there through his whole life. But what about Huck Finn? Well, if he could have managed middle of the night, or more precisely a chunk past midnight, he would have been doing quite well. These things happen. Little reminders that the author is back there someplace, just as they are reminders that that authorial voice or that narrative voice is not entirely the author. Now we look at such things throughout fiction, and sometimes use of voice is obvious. Hey, you can't mistake Huck Finn for Twain or Sam Clemens. But sometimes voice is so much like the author, much as the author can manage. Jack Kerouac wanted to write 100% truth in On the Road. The original version was written as autobiography on the original scroll that he wrote, and Neil Cassidy, Allen Ginsberg, and everybody else were referenced by their real names. The Kerouac displayed is Kerouac as he imagined himself, though, not as he was. People who knew Kerouac could tell you that. Now, writers of genre fiction, these people who do this stuff that they pump off as pot boilers, guess what they're masterful at? Creating personas. Ed McBain, for example, is one of about 4 identities claimed by a detective novel writer. And each one of these identities is attached to a particular style of writing. He does hard-boiled detective things. He does whodunit. He does police personas or police procedures and does them as different personas. Sometimes that first-person narrator is as much like the author as Kerouac's. Sometimes that first-person figure is highly fictionalized. Now, T.C. Boyle, we're going to look at Greasy Lake. He's been known as suggested he had a bad period, but Greasy Lake's first-person protagonist is not T.C. Boyle. It's based on figures out of rock and roll songs, not his life. I can tell you, quite personally and easily, I am not the lone wanderer who fills the first-person role in some of the ghost stories that I write those for my own pleasure. Hopefully I don't even have to tell you I'm not the first-person ghost in a couple of the stories. Really, I'm not dead. Honest, I'm not. See? Okay? Now, so what's our point? Narrative voice of a piece is exactly as much or as little like the author as the author chooses, with the one big caveat that this depends on the skill of the author. Better authors have better control over their voices than weaker ones. And that is authorial voice, persona, narrative voice, and such as that.